Internationally regarded as one of the foremost biological and sociological theorists of the late 20th century, and on the other hand dubbed a racist and a sexist whose theories are viewed by some to support Darwinian survival of the fittest and genetic determinism, two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author and Harvard University researcher and professor Edward O.Wilson casts a broad and inclusive net. Among his many awards, Wilson has received the U.S. National Medal of Science and Japan's International Prize for Biology. And in 1996, Time magazine named Wilson one of the nation's 25 most influential people. Whether defending sociobiology as the systematic study of the biological basis of all social behavior, or describing consilience as the search for proof of the alignment of knowledge from different disciplines, Edward O. Wilson teases exploration and challenges conventional thought and knowledge. Join him now in conversation with Patricia Churchland of UCSD's Department of Philosophy.
Good morning. What a great pleasure to have you at UCSD. You are one of those unusual and really wonderful scientists who spans many disciplines and who can talk not only to the scientists but also to those of us who are in the humanities.
Thank you so much, Pat.
In 1959, C.P. Snow wrote about two cultures, and it was within, of course, the larger culture that we live in, but it was a culture having to do with science on the one hand and, broadly speaking, arts and humanities on the other. Now, do you still see a gulf between these sort of two ways of thinking about things, and what kind of a gulf is it, if it does exist?
Yeah, I think it still exists, but it's increasingly a cultural artifact because science has advanced to a stage where the subjects that are central to the humanities and the social sciences can be investigated, at least in part, by more scientific methods. We know so much more now. Your work reflects this very well, out of philosophy going in the other direction. We know so much more about how the mind works and what the cellular basis of it is and how it's evolved. We only understand bits and pieces, but it's beginning to come into focus. So that some of the central questions of the humanities, including philosophy, such as what is mind, where did it come from, what is the nature of what used to be called man, of humanity, humankind, what is our origin and where are we headed, and all of those basic questions that are dealt with at various levels in various ways so brilliantly by the humanities are now further illuminated with the possibility of accepting into their fold and into their whole way of thinking and teaching and researching the natural sciences. So the prospects are there. We're of a unity of science with the humanities. I think we're really on the cusp of an intellectual revolution in which all of those connections in that gulf of largely unexplored phenomena that has previously separated science from humanity, that is about to be filled in.
And do you see from both sides an eagerness to kind of hold hands across what used to be at least a gulf? I mean, is there a real interest in science and addressing these large questions about the nature of the mind or the nature of free will on the one hand, and from, say, philosophers and those in literature, what that might mean in scientific terms? Is there a kind of meeting of minds, do you think?
That's an interesting question, and the answer is a bit troubling. In fact, there is not a great deal yet, in spite of the fact that the opportunities are enormous, and the subject is beginning to develop. Surprisingly little movement by the mass of people working in scientists, working in biology, and scholars in the social sciences and humanities to how shall we say, colonize that intermediate area. And I think that's partly due to the fact that most scientists are, well, let's put it frankly, they're very narrow people. Their lives are devoted to making discoveries. And generally speaking, to make a discovery, you have to move out onto the advancing front of a field, usually one that's well established, and see if you can't get a piece of the action there. And many scientists devote their entire lives to that, and they don't think about the larger questions. They don't think of this intermediate area of neuroscience and genetics and brain sciences that are beginning to fill in the area, along with the deeper studies of some of the aspects of the theory of the arts and so on. They don't see that yet in terms of the big questions that would give them maximum opportunity. And I believe that on the part of the humanities, you may disagree with it, but on the part of the humanities, they too are absorbed with their culture to the extent that they really don't want to get involved with science. So the two sides can see each other. An increasing number on both sides see that yes, there really is an intermediate level of the study of mind and evolution and the commonalities of culture and human nature and so on, that lies there waiting for us to explore cooperatively, if only we could get together. But there isn't an awful lot of movement to make a, go for the brass ring, so to speak. If I were a young scholar, I'll tell you, Pat, and saw things the way I did now, that's where I'd be. I'd have my 2 mules and my camping equipment, and I'd be heading out there.
I do agree, actually, that there is tremendous potential for action there. I wonder if the two cultures that C.P. Snow talked about were perhaps more separated than we may be now, because neurobiology and molecular biology hadn't really developed to a point where people could see what an understanding of the brain might actually tell us about the nature of things like decision-making and choice. People really were much more caught up in a way with physics. And I think now that neurobiology and molecular biology and ethology have developed so tremendously, you can begin to see things slightly differently. Does that seem reasonable to you?
Yeah, I think that's actually the answer, for the reason that it did seem kind of set in concrete 30, 40 years ago, but that's no longer the case. It's interesting that you have often referred to a field of neurophilosophy. It has a strange ring to it, and yet it also has a good deal of the future, I think, implied in it. 40 years ago, when Snow did make that famous complaint, mostly directed at the humanities scholars.
Yes, it was.
It's true. The humanities scholars and the social scientists could look over to the sciences, and particularly to biology, and they could say, well, you know, it's nice to know that neurobiology, the way nerve cells work and so on, it's coming along rapidly and so on. But they're not within a country mile of beginning to even develop models of how the brain would work. That's probably way beyond them, way beyond us. So we really want to get involved with something that may never work. And then they would come to social behavior, which is the subject of a lot of work in evolutionary biology through fields like sociobiology and evolutionary psychology today. They didn't exist 40 years ago, and there was no conception, even among the biologists, of how, or very little, of how social behavior, social groupings and communication and altruistic connections and so on could evolve. So there was not much there. And then, of course, the other field coming from biology that can help build bridges between science and humanities, genetics, was, well, it was advancing rapidly, but it was very difficult even for the biologists to conceive how you go from genes to way up to culture in any way that would mean anything for humanities scholars.
And that has changed profoundly. I mean, there seemed to me to be kind of, in a way, two particular things that are very impressive about developments in genetics and molecular biology vis-a-vis the humanities. And the first one, of course, we discovered only recently, and that is that humans only have about 30,000 genes. And the other thing, at least that I find tremendously impressive, is the conservation in structure and morphology and in the building blocks between all organisms. I mean, it's extraordinary, I think, that you can take a gene, the so-called regulatory master gene from the mouse eye, that builds the mouse eye, and put it in Drosophila and you get an eye. And the conservation, so what do you think the conservation should tell us about, or at least cause us to think about with regard to the deeper issues of human nature vis-a-vis the nature of other primates, the nature of other mammals, the nature of reptiles? How does it focus you?
Well, it does, as you said, tell us that evolution has been extremely conservative. The power of natural selection, which is, of course, that generation by generation weeding out of less fit, that is, of organisms, phenotypes of organisms that cannot survive as well or reproduce as well. That is so inexorable and powerful, such that only a 0.1% difference or less, say, between two phenotypes, slight variations, can result in one coming to prevail, say in 10 generations or so, and the other virtually disappear. So there's this great power behind natural selection, which means that organisms have evolved very conservatively. They have tended to take the building blocks in the genes that they have and not fool around with them very much, but tinker a little bit, and an opportunity for filling a new niche, doing something new, is approached by altering genes, usually that are already there in some simple way, and you get a different effect. Sometimes you get a larger effect, but usually it's just a little. And if that then leads to some kind of a breakthrough, then you can have a chorus of these regulatory genes developing that shape it and push the species on through. But it's still very seldom that we would get changes in master genes, primary building block genes. However, obviously in the case of human beings, we really are something new under the sun. I mean, you can see the prototypes of a lot of human behavior, including proto-culture, primitive culture, in chimpanzees, for example. You can see things like intrigue and Machiavellian rivalries and so on in chimps. But humans, by developing a productive language with arbitrary symbols and so on, really did break through. However, as you well know, we still have a powerful residue of our animal origin. And one of the most notable, worth citing just to make the point, is the way we avoid incest, the so-called Westermarck effect. Two people who are together in close domestic proximity, in the first 30 months of the life of either one, by a switch in the brain and development of behavior in the brain that we don't understand yet, but it's certainly there. They are turned off permanently. They can't form later sexual bonds, and that's a way of avoiding incest built in, hardwired into it. And the remarkable thing about it is that this is the same one found in the other primates. Our primate closest relatives, monkeys and apes, have the same kind of avoidance mechanism, and that's distinctive to the primates. So this is an example, very likely, of the residue of our ancestry that's still built into the hard wiring.
Do you think that the distinction between nature and nurture, which we all know is really a much too sort of simple catchphrase, but do you think that that distinction is really changing now and getting much more complicated because we understand that there are genes that control the expression of other genes, that control the expression of other genes, that is the regulatory genes? Does it seem to you that what was once a kind of simple distinction about which people had these very heated debates, blah, blah, blah. Does it look different to you now?
Oh, vastly. And I think
Yeah.
to geneticists and developmental
Yeah.
biologists also. You know, one of these epigenetic or built-in developmental rules of the human mind, the way the human mind develops, is almost certainly our tendency to make binary classifications. That's how we handle
Yes,
reality.
yes, yes.
And, you know, we're speaking of conservatism in the way the genes work, and then there's also conservatism in the way the mind works. And one of the rules of thumb that people seem to follow worldwide is to, when they deal with a complicated phenomenon, insist on dividing it into two parts, you know, dichotomize it. So thus we have this powerful tendency to say kin, non-kin, insider, outsider, and so on, which is the source of so much of the trouble in human relations. And so when it comes to heredity and environment, we've done the same thing. But that is obsolete by many years. Now geneticists have whole new concepts of dealing with it. Unfortunately, they're much more complicated than just saying nature versus nurture. And they involve things like the norm of reaction, which is to take a gene or an ensemble of genes that a person might have, and then, in theory anyway, you can do this with simpler animals, with simpler behavior. Difficult to do with a human, but in theory anyway, we should be able to say, well, having that set of genes allows you a lot of flexibility, but it's not endless. And eventually you could define most of the environments, in theory, that people could grow up in or be in, and their development, which would be an interaction of the genes with the environment, and get a complete array of possible outcomes for that individual, in theory. And that would be the norm of reaction. So this is one way that geneticists and developmental biologists have reconfigured our whole treatment. But which, you know, we're not going to get all the way there and solve this vexing problem of genes versus, or heredity versus environment, until finally a fuller map of human development, right down to the proteins. This is done, and how the brain is assembled is done, and that's still a long way off. This entails what's called proteomics. That is a complete study, as complete as possible, of the schedule of activation of all these genes, the proteins that result from their activation, and the way there may be 100,000 of these, you know, compared to the 30,000 genes, and the very complicated ways that these proteins are manufactured, elaborated, positioned, and interact with one another. And when we get to that level, then at least from the level of the cell and the way the brain is put together in the form of cells, will become much more evident. And that truly will make the old heredity versus environment dichotomy obsolete.
Yeah, and I think your point about neural development is especially salient here, because it does look like, I mean, correct me on this, but it does look like one of the things that evolution stumbled onto fairly early is the fact that it doesn't have to put everything into the gene for building an organism, that it can rely upon regularities existing in the environment and can count upon interactions between those regularities and the genes to turn on other genes. And if that's true, then that already means that there's a great fuzzy area between the so-called nature on one hand and nurture on the other hand.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. You know, it's in fact, that distinction between nature and nurture may disappear to the point where we recognize correctly that regularities in the environment are virtually part of the genetic program, that is genetic return program. Incest avoidance is an excellent case.
Yeah, I
you know,
think
that
so.
the hard wiring that makes us not really have close sexual bonding with someone that we are at a very early age live closely with depends upon the regularity in which closely related people, and especially parents and offspring, are together. That's an environmental effect. I mean,
Yes.
and yet that's almost like part of the genetic program.
It is. In fact, I may have learned this from you, but I gathered that there is a species of turtle where the sex of the offspring is determined not by having a particular chromosome or a particular gene, it's determined by the temperature of the sand that the eggs incubate in. And I always thought, well, you know, that if anything, should be a striking example that says to us, nature and nurture as a sort of two distinct and completely different bins doesn't hold anymore.
Yeah, that's very true. There's a good example of a norm of reaction.
Yes,
You know,
yes, indeed.
a certain temperature in the sand,
That's right.
you develop that way.
Yeah.
Another temperature, you develop that way. Biology is full of examples like this,
Yes.
where amazingly small differences that make a difference later on in survival or reproduction cause one alternative, or as opposed to another, to be followed in the development of that individual. But that, we have to keep in mind, this is not, this development is not a blank slate.
For sure.
There are only a certain number of alternatives, maybe 2 or 3 or 4, maybe in human beings, 5,016, but they are under substantial genetic control, and we'll fully understand them when we've really worked out more of the interaction between the developing organism and its environment.
Let me ask you a question from a slightly different direction. Sometimes when my students see me get very enthusiastic about the brain and about possibilities for understanding, say, how decisions are made and the nature of consciousness, they say, but surely this is going to take all the mystery out of it. And I don't think we should know that much about humans. I mean, wouldn't we miss the mystery? I mean, I find that hard to respond to in a way, because I think that knowing is always better than not knowing. But I would be most interested to see how you respond to that.
Well, there you go as a philosopher. That's a really good philosophical question. But it's also, I guess, in a way, a scientific question.
It is, I think, broadly.
I think the answer to that is that the array of possibilities in this amazing planet we live on and these amazing evolving societies we live in mean that there is, for an indefinite period of time into the future, so long that we shouldn't be worrying about it, in which human beings actually find that they have more to explore and learn at the scientific level as well as the individual level, the more we know. And just take, for example, one of my favorite subjects I'm on right now is that we probably know only 10% of the species of plant animals and microorganisms on Earth. There may be as many as 20 or 30 million species on Earth. And each one of these has its own history, going in some cases back millions of years, its own genes, its own not perfect, but very tight adaptation to the environment. And just to be able to explore that represents, should I say, the equivalent of, even though we understand the human mind as a machine, what a machine. You know, it's a machine beyond our comprehension now, and the things that you can do with it is even farther beyond our comprehension. So I don't think, we're all going to be wandering around any time in the future in a zombie-like state saying, well, we know it all and I just have to punch it up. Anything I can't think of right now, punch it up on the computer and it's all there, so what's the use?
Yes, I do agree. And I do also think that the worry that sometimes people have that if we understand these things, we'll be able to predict sort of movement by movement everything that a person does. I think that's really quite wrong-headed also. I mean, there's just too many nerve cells and too many synapses and things are happening too fast to make prediction realistic, except in the way that we commonly do now. I mean, I can predict that you will be hungry long about lunchtime and that you'll want to go to bed long about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock and so forth. Now, but given these developments in molecular biology, ethology, and ecology, and so on, do you see any particular practical things that one might also say to students, practical implications of these developments that would both address the issue of the mystery, but also the issue of bringing the sciences and the humanities closer? I mean, what particular practical ramifications interest you or seem especially important to you?
Well, I think that the more we fill in that huge area, with knowledge, And that's going to require collaboration of humanities scholars, social scientists, and who have the information, who have all of the nuances in the history and so on. Collaboration of them with the scientists, these are primarily the biologists moving into this area, is going to give almost an endless number of applications in almost any field you want. We haven't brought up ethics.
Yes.
And maybe unless we had the rest of the afternoon, we shouldn't get too deeply into it. But right there, you have so many important applications. The more we understand how the mind works, the more we understand what the human beings need, what relationships they can develop harmoniously, the way they can have maximum self-fulfillment. All these things, I think, will improve the more we know about the mind and what are the relationships between genetics and development. And this is certainly an immensely important area in psychology and the study of ethics. And then that spills into areas like the law, common law. The evolution of common law depends on our intuitive, has grown from our intuitive into understanding of what is right and wrong, and so on through virtually every other field. And if I were a young scholar, as I indicated earlier, I would want to move into this area, or at least be poised to become a player in it if I had any interest at all in human behavior.
So if we understood more about aggression, or we understood more about xenophobia, for example, we might be able to have a more measured response or a more efficacious response.
Oh yeah, I could not agree more. I don't want to engage in too much fantasy, but let's put it this way. If we had a highly educated Sharon and his cabinet, and a highly educated Arafat and his lieutenants, and they had learned to depend, and were justified in doing it, on advisors in psychology, social science, and so on, about the best way to resolve the problems that they're facing, an exceedingly difficult problem, which would include an understanding of likely responses and counter-responses and aggressive encounters and the like, they might have been much more inclined to actually sit down and arrive at a solution, knowing that that was the solution that would work.
I do agree. Thank you so much for this. It's been a great pleasure.
Thanks for the opportunity.